Hyperlight Drifter is a game that uses its medium to perfectly express the talents and messages of its creators, with awe-inspiring visuals, an incredible soundtrack, and a strong storytelling format. Hyperlight Drifter is art. And like all great art, Hyperlight Drifter conveys a beautiful message, one with a personal connection to the artist. Alex Preston is the creator and lead designer of Hyperlight Drifter, and his inspiration for the game came from his own life. Alex suffers from congenital heart disease, and the subsequent knowledge that he could die at any second. He has to deal with the fact that death is always looming over him, waiting to strike. It is this haunting experience that Alex embeds in his creation. Woven into Hyperlight Drifter is an allegory for coming to terms with a terminal condition and how people react to having to face their own mortality. Hyperlight Drifter tells its story without a single line of dialogue. The only text you'll see in the entire game is tutorial text. Any character that speaks does so in a series of images. The only written information we get in the game comes from these monoliths, and even these need to be translated outside of the game to be understood. Even the names of each character or item or place are left unknown. So much in this game is abstract, in a way that transcends language. One person might call this northern boss the Hierophant, after its tarot card assignment on Steam. Another might call it the Jerk Pope, or even Priscilla the Parrot. But it is the same creature nonetheless. This abstract storytelling paves a clear path for the implementation of metaphor in Hyperlight Drifter. To understand the allegory that the game presents, however, it is important to first understand its components. Hyperlight Drifter follows the journey of a character most commonly referred to by players as the Drifter. The Drifter, who is the main playable character in the game, represents Alex Preston, or at the very least, someone in his situation, someone facing an impending death. Like Alex, the Drifter is slowly dying from a terminal illness, and his starting goal, although not explicitly stated in the game, is said by Alex to be to seek out a cure, as any self-preserving creature would do. Yet, this search for the cure is not the Drifter's main arc of the story. In fact, there is no cure. The Drifter dies alone in an underground cavern with the ceiling collapsing over him. But it isn't a sad ending. Because Hyperlight Drifter isn't about searching for a cure from death. It's about something much more powerful. Another character critical to the allegory of Hyperlight Drifter is this Jackal, who guides the Drifter throughout the game. This mysterious canine, often referred to as Anubis, assists the Drifter in his journey of coming to terms with death. Anubis guides the Drifter to reach the Immortal Cell, a device that represents both the desire to live and the desire for immortality. This cell is protected by Anubis's foil in Hyperlight Drifter, a character often referred to as Judgment. Judgment represents the fear of death, which helps protect the desire to live. While these two are both integral tools for human survival, when we are faced with a looming oblivion, they can quickly turn against us. Just as Judgment corrupts the Immortal Cell as he protects it in the game, so too can the fear of death corrupt the desire for life when faced with the possibility of a permanent end. If the Drifter wishes to make peace with his mortality, he must eventually face his fear and defeat it head-on. The final component to cover is the Titans. The Titans are giant, powerful, mechanical representations of the tools and causes of death. At some point, long before the events of the game, the Titans laid waste to the world of Hyperlight Drifter. Eventually, however, they were brought down. Each cardinal region had their own way of defeating the Titans that attacked them, representative of the unique desires each region holds in regard to dealing with death. The remains of these Titans also serve a role in displaying how even the largest and most powerful beings, be they natural or artificial, eventually die and decay. Now that we've covered some of the major components of the allegory, it is time to finally enter the world of Hyperlight Drifter. What you just saw was the opening sequence of Hyperlight Drifter. No words, no text, no explanation. Just stunning visuals and atmospheric soundtrack. This abstract presentation allows each person to come to their own conclusions about the themes and the ideas conveyed. Additionally, given the intentional uninvolved nature of both Alex Preston and the rest of the development team, when it comes to interpreting this game, it is perfectly acceptable to find a different message than somebody else. The message and metaphor covered in this essay are by no means the only possible interpretations. For example, just as much as it introduces the allegory of Hyperlight Drifter, the opening itself also serves to introduce the player to the world they are entering. Yet despite the countless messages and meanings that can be found in this opening, Hyperlight Drifter's introduction undoubtedly lays the groundwork for its allegory of coming to terms with death. While this opening scene is packed with metaphor and information far outside the scope of this essay, the focus will remain on the key factors of Hyperlight Drifter's allegory. The first shot of significance to this metaphor is the imagery of 4 different animals in each of the 4 cardinal directions, offering pillars of light to the central depiction of Anubis. This shot alludes to the inhabitants of the 4 cardinal regions of Hyperlight Drifter, and their preoccupation with death. The next shot of importance depicts the Titans, looming in the background of the wasteland that they created. We are then introduced to the Drifter, and he in turn is introduced to the imagery of the tools of death and the corpses of those who have perished all around him. Yet, the Drifter is not fazed by this unpleasant scenery. It is only when death comes to him personally that his fear fully manifests. This turning point represents the diagnosis of a terminal illness, or in Alex Preston's case, the point where he first truly understood the meaning of his condition. It is the point where the fear of death first begins to turn against us, when it first begins to corrupt us from the inside. At first, the Drifter fights his fear head-on. Then, when this fails, he instead runs from it. Thinking he has escaped his fear, the Drifter defiantly draws his sword, only to be faced with the horrific sight of the tools of death, stirring up his sense of dread once more. This then shifts into a reminder of the inevitability of his death, as the Titans crumble before his eyes. The Drifter is then met by Anubis, who leads him into introspection, guiding him through his own mind towards the catharsis that he needs to reach. The Drifter sees his will to live, surrounded by the corruption of fear. He realizes that if he is truly to be at peace with death, he must get rid of this mental corruption. But when the Drifter tries to get close, to reach his corrupt will to live and reclaim it for himself, his fear paralyzes him, holding him back from being able to accept his fate. This introduction clearly establishes Judgment, the fear of death, as the antagonist of both the story and the metaphor. However, excluding a few brief moments, Judgment does not fully take center stage again until the final act of Hyperlight Drifter. Even so, his corruption is present throughout every region in the game. It is important to note that Judgment is not limited to the version that the Drifter sees. Judgment represents the fear of death, but this fear is unique to each individual person. Judgment manifests in different forms for different individuals, as evidenced by this character's description of him. This mirrors the abstract nature of fear itself. Each person experiences it in a unique way, but when described, it is easily identifiable. So while the Drifter doesn't see Judgment in any of the areas, outside of the moments when he is dealing with his personal fear of death, Judgment as a concept is present in each of the regions, corrupting the ways their inhabitants cope with mortality. Four of the 5 regions of Hyperlight Drifter are located in each of the 4 cardinal directions. with the northern, eastern, and western regions available for exploration in any order, with the southern region saved for last. The fifth region lies in the center, a town that acts as a hub of sorts, where upgrades can be bought and each of the other 4 regions can be accessed. All 5 regions of Hyperlight Drifter represent methods of dealing with mortality, and the different ways that the fear of death can corrupt these methods. The Drifter, still unable to get past his own version of judgment, traverses these regions in order to find a way to cope with his condition. As he explores, however, he slowly realizes that if he is to rid himself of his burden, he must prepare himself for another confrontation with judgment. The mountainous northern region of Hyperlight Drifter represents coping with death through religion. The story of this region is of 2 in-game religions, one providing a healthier outlook on life and death, and the other serving as a cautionary tale. The Drifter learns through the dialogue box of a bird hermit that the main society in the north used to be one of pacifist religion and in-depth ritual. The members of this old religion focus mainly on raising and caring for their young. This represents turning to religion when faced with death to make a mark on the world and leave it a better place. It represents the preparation for the afterlife, preparation for both oneself and the world they leave behind. However, from the same bird hermit, the Drifter learns how a group of dissenters, obsessed with immortality, formed a new religion and took over the north in a midnight coup, burning and killing any who would stand in their way. This new cult is based on attempting to evade death by sacrificing members, even sometimes their own young. The fear of death has corrupted the members of the cult, even to the degree that they blindly follow the orders of the Hierophant, a seemingly large and powerful leader who the Drifter reveals to be just a normal bird in a big suit. The Cult of the North displays how, while turning to religion can be healthy, turning to one out of the pure fear of death only leads to a loss of self. The northern region also represents the desire to escape and evade death, the desire to hide away from any possible danger. The northern region defeated their titan, overcame their allegorical cause of death, by simply living in the mountains, high enough to where it froze to death before it could ever reach them. This alludes to how the fear of death can make one want to run away and hide, to push away close friends and loved ones, and to isolate oneself completely. In the most fitting way, the birds of the north represent the flight aspect of fight or flight. And while this instinct can be more than helpful in keeping humans alive in dangerous situations, it only does harm when the danger comes from something that can't be outrun, like a terminal illness. Hiding and isolating oneself only makes the remaining moments of life unbearable. Pushing friends and family away in hopes of protecting them is not the noble cause it seems, and it only cuts them off with the knowledge that they still had the opportunity to share even one last moment. No matter how many people are sacrificed by the bird cult, no matter how many people they cut out of their lives, the only reward they will get is one less companion and the weight of what they have done. Throughout the North, the Drifter is shown how the fear of death can corrupt when mortality cannot be escaped. Having made his way past the cult of the Zealous, the Drifter activates a giant pillar, taking one step closer to his final goal. While the North may present the corruption of flight, the eastern region of Hyperlight Drifter strongly conveys a horrific fight response. The beautiful blue waters and the peaceful yet contemplative music of this region are a devious facade for an area filled with the sickening imagery of genocide. The Drifter learns from one of the genocide escapees that the Lake of the East used to be ruled and mainly populated by otter people. Recently, however, a violent faction of toads, under the rule of a behemoth many players refer to as the Emperor, have taken to murdering and enslaving the entirety of the otter population, leaving piles of bodies and heads on pikes to warn off anyone who dares trespass on their newly acquired home. Prominent as they may be, the dangers of the fight response aren't the only message sent by the eastern region of Hyperlight Drifter. Rather, the toads of the lake represent the self-indulgent and egotistical response to a terminal condition. Similar to the calming music in the serene waters of the lake, many of the enemies seem deceptively innocent on the surface. It took longer than usual to register that these bomber toads were even enemies, because the first time one is seen, it is shown sitting peacefully, minding its own business. It comes as quite the surprise when the toad stands up and, instead of starting a nice conversation, immediately begins hurling projectiles at the Drifter. Similarly, the secondary enemy type in this region consists of creatures that appear to be harmless flowers. That is, until they attack. Once their facade drops, these creatures are monstrous, hurling their plant bodies at the Drifter and proving to be formidable foes. This theme of deceptive appearances is representative of how, even though self-indulgence and egotism in response to a looming death can seem excusable and even normal on the surface, it distorts those that rely too heavily on it and takes from everything and everyone around them. This is not to say that those who may be a bit selfish or egotistic are doomed to commit genocide. Rather, the presentation of the East emphasizes that there are consequences to these approaches, giving ample warning to avoid an excess of these responses when faced with an impending death. The East also conveys the fear-driven desire to consume, to grow so large and strong that even death itself cannot bring down the end result. This desire to consume can clearly be seen in the Emperor, a gargantuan toad who introduces himself by eating the corpse of a dead otter. It can also be seen in how the toads banded together under the Emperor, and took their now poisoned homeland for themselves. Despite the aggressive nature of the toads, the otters are never shown fighting back. To the Emperor and his followers, they are simply resources to be plundered in the corrupted goal of becoming stronger than death. It is unknown what specific role the otters played, but the Titan of the eastern region of Hyperlight Drifter was ultimately defeated by the lake itself. This Titan can be seen almost completely submerged underwater, desperately searching for a platform with which to pull itself out. The lake, immense in size and power, is not only able to drown a Titan, but also remains almost entirely unpolluted, retaining a pure and peaceful blue color even when filled with the bodies of giants and otters alike. The East, put simply, represents the desire to be the lake, to drown their cause of death through sheer volume alone. It represents the urge to take and use everything from one's surroundings, to outpace death, regardless of how this affects others. When taken to the absolute extreme, this reaction can needlessly drain everything from friends and family, leaving them unable to support themselves, all in trade for just a few more drops squeezed out of life. Again, however, this desire is not inherently wrong. There is a rather clear border between simply wanting to spend more time on this earth and pulling others down in an attempt to stay afloat. What is important about the message of the East is that it serves as a reminder that unless proper care is taken to still consider others, it can be difficult to tell when the line has been crossed. Having seen what he needs to from the East, the Drifter activates the Pillar of the Lake and takes his next step towards an answer. The western region of Hyperlight Drifter is unique from all other directional regions in that the main faction of enemies, the Raccoon Knights and Pistoliers, are not overtly evil. Unlike the Birds of the North, who murder the young and the weak, or the Toads of the East, who outright commit racial genocide, the Raccoons of the West are simply soldiers who can be reasonably argued to be defending their territory. Whether this defense is necessary, however, is a different question altogether. These soldiers attack the Drifter without question, aggressively defending every inch of their land. They don't stop to see if the Drifter means harm, they just reject whatever is unfamiliar to them. This represents a similar response when faced with a terminal condition, where all outside activities and new experiences are shut out in an excessive effort to preserve the body. This is not a novel response in humans, and in fact, it falls in line with some of the themes the North and the East display. While fight or flight was the original phrase coined by Walter Cannon to describe the mental response to danger, later research determined that another category was present in the mix. While the East is fight and the North is flight, the West represents the freeze reaction, where no action is taken at all out of the fear of making the danger worse. Though this response tends to occur when both fight and flight have been ruled out as options, it can be just as useful in keeping humans alive in the face of danger. However, as with every other region, this response has its consequences when corrupted and taken to the extreme. A common name for the western region of Hyperlight Drifter is the Crystal Forest, a moniker that comes from the crystals that jut out from the ground throughout the entire region. The Drifter learns from the Raccoon Hermit, one of the few who eventually broke free of their crystals, that these structures are a byproduct of the West's battle against their Titan. The West defeated their Titan by encasing it in crystal, representative of the desire to stop death's most useful tool, time. The West represents the desire to preserve and maintain the current state, in hopes of preventing the body from deteriorating further. But doing so also prevents any good change from happening, and suspends life at its current state, unable to be experienced, even if death is avoided. The technology that the raccoons created does defeat the Titan, but it also freezes many of them in crystals, trapping them. Even those that do escape the crystals are still trapped, viciously defending the territory from a threat that isn't there, unable to appreciate the life that they preserve. The boss of this area is referred to as either the Hanged Man, after his tarot card, or the Last General, after his soundtrack moniker. This general is aggressive, defending his land with leaping melee attacks and leaving no room for error. However, death eventually claims him, and he dies encased in crystal. Yet, even this is unable to preserve his body, as it breaks in half, falling to the ground in defeat. Freezing is not guaranteed to preserve the body in life, and this scene displays that sometimes it cannot even do so in death. Bodies naturally decay, life eventually ends. When faced with death and the long panic that precedes it, it is better to thaw out of the freeze response, and enjoy life while it still remains. The Drifter, now having broken the stasis of so many, arrives at the Pillar of the West, activates it, and turns his focus southward. Throughout the first 3 cardinal regions, the Drifter does not face his journey completely alone, and certainly not without help. In fact, near the very beginning of the game, it is established that the Drifter is unable to complete his journey by himself. Before properly exploring even a single region, the Drifter collapses somewhere in the mountains, brought down by either his disease, the sphere of death, or some combination of both. He is saved and brought to the central town by a mysterious character known most commonly as the Guardian. The Guardian makes most of the same journey as the Drifter does. He visits each region, suffers from the same terminal illness, and faces his own version of judgment. Though the Guardian takes the same path as the Drifter, he always seems to be one step ahead, with the Drifter always catching up to him just as he finishes a battle. The Guardian represents a friend or mentor figure, perhaps even a parent, who is also facing a terminal illness, just a few steps ahead. Despite being much further along on his journey, the Guardian is more than happy to share his experience and advice with the Drifter. This advice takes the in-game form of him telling the Drifter where 4 of the modules in each region are. The Guardian, being further along in his journey and able to give advice to the Drifter, at first seems much more capable and organized in his search to come to terms with his illness. By the time the Drifter reaches the south, however, this is called into question. In one of the very first rooms of the southern region of Hyperlight Drifter, the Guardian is found doubled over in pain. It is soon very clear that the Drifter is witnessing the Guardian's final moments. The Guardian takes the time to share one last bit of advice with the Drifter, and then tells him about his plight. The Guardian speaks of how his entire family succumbed to the illness that now plagues him, and how he had to say goodbye to each and every one of them, and somehow still carry on. It was then that he encountered Anubis, signifying his own diagnosis with the condition and the starting of his countdown clock. The Guardian perishes in the company of the Drifter, leaving it unknown whether he defeated his version of judgment or if he died afraid of the void that overtook him. Although he is not able to personally accompany the Drifter in facing judgment, the Guardian clearly poses an important role in the Drifter's journey. Anubis, the Drifter's true guide, intentionally leads the Drifter towards the Guardian in every region, clearly believing him to be a significant companion for the Drifter to have. This highlights the importance of having someone to empathize with, someone who personally understands what it is like to be in the same situation. Though parting with the Guardian is heartbreaking, his presence ultimately helps the Drifter along in his journey, making their companionship worth it in the end. After saying his final goodbyes, the Drifter continues on, heading further into the south. the southern region of Hyperlight Drifter doesn't have a fallen titan. In fact, on the surface, the south doesn't seem to have much of anything at all. A few scorpions here, a scanner there, but nothing that poses a threat, and certainly nothing that attacks the Drifter. The lizard people the Drifter talks to on the surface speak of foreboding threats and dangerous technology, but up top, there is nothing to be found. Instead, all the action of the South Zone takes place underground, underneath the barren hills. When the Drifter first descends into the depths of the southern region, he is immersed within a giant city of laboratories. These labs are populated with artificially grown creatures and sentry robots, along with 4 technological terrors, sentient machines that serve as the 4 bosses of the South. But nothing compares to the most harrowing discovery that the Drifter makes in these cavernous labs. The Society of the South never fought a Titan because they were the ones who created them in the first place. The desire represented by the abandoned Titan of the South is not one of conquering mortality, but rather a desire to control it, to become the master of both life and death. Just as the real world has advanced modern medicine and developed powerful nuclear weapons, so too has the world of Hyperlight Drifter striven to create the tools of life and death. The southern population all but succeeded in creating these tools, as evidenced by the immensely powerful Titans, or even, as the presence of certain lab tanks suggest, the Drifter himself. A crystallized scene by the fallen Titan of the West further indicates that the Drifter and his kind were tools of death, as they fought alongside the now fallen Titan. This scene recontextualizes the Drifter as more than just a creature fearing death and fighting for a cure. Indeed, despite himself suffering from a terminal illness, the Drifter is a pervasive cause of death for the occupants of the regions he visits. The Drifter is a harsh reminder for each region that death cannot be escaped. No matter how zealous or secluded the Cult of the North is, the Drifter still strikes down the Hierophant and many of his followers. No matter how violent or powerful the Toads of the East become, the Drifter still usurps their throne. No matter how rigid or guarded the West is, the Drifter still slices his way through the Crystal Forest and eventually through their last general. And finally, no matter the advances of the technology of the South, in spite of the fact that they themselves may have created the Drifter, he fulfills his role as the Hand of Death, bringing down the Reaper, the Summoner, the Sorcerer, and finally, the Archer. Like the southern region itself, the use of advanced technology to master life and death does not seem sinister on the surface. Modern medicine has increased both the life and health span of the average person over the past few centuries. Terrifying as they may be, the development of nuclear weapons has ensured a stalemate of mutually assured destruction, allowing for times of technically greater peace, although it is far from complete. Yet, no matter the advances of technology, neither life nor death can ever be fully tamed. Like the Titans, nuclear weapons destroy indiscriminately, leaving only wastelands behind them. Even some of the more precise tools, like antibiotics, can accidentally create superbugs resistant to all known medication. Genetic modification has to be done carefully and in moderation, and even when it only provides benefits, humans have a tendency to reject it out of the fear of the unknown. Mirroring the messages of the North, East, and West, the lesson of the South is not to outright refuse the use of technology or the desire to overcome a terminal condition. Rather, the South, along with the rest of Hyperlight Drifter, teaches moderation and conveys the consequences of excess. with lessons about zeal and isolation from the north, power and self-indulgence from the east, preservation and rigidity from the west, and finally technology and hubris from the south, the Drifter activates the Pillar of the Barren Hills and heads back to town to face the abyss underneath. The central town of Hyperlight Drifter is the only place where combat and violence are not permitted. Within the bounds of this town, the Drifter cannot slash his sword, shoot his gun, or even aim. Each input is instead replaced with a more appropriate gesture. One of the only places the Drifter can perform his usual actions is on this field, as he unsuccessfully tries to defeat a small child at this game's version of soccer. Other than this, however, the town is mostly conflict-free. The town represents the ignorance of death, a unique approach compared to every other region's portrayal of going head-to-head with mortality. Nevertheless, it certainly seems like the central town has found in ignorance the most successful way of coping with death. Absent from this region is the violent fervor of the north, the ruthless genocide of the east, the cold retaliation of the west, or the malicious technology of the south. Instead, people play instruments, tend to gardens, watch peacefully as their child dominates a grown man in soccer, run stores and shops, and live pleasant lives in general. Out of every region in Hyperlight Drifter, the central town is by far the most civilized. Yet despite being much more successful than the other regions, the town's coping mechanism does come with a few consequences. At the end of an alley in an empty corner of town, the Drifter finds a man slowly drinking himself to death. Though the man seems at first to be just a plain drunkard, when he speaks to the Drifter, a different story is unveiled. His tale represents the tragically common response from death-ignorant communities toward those who are faced with mortality. This character comes to town bringing literal baggage with him, and the members of the peaceful city do not treat him kindly for it. The consequence of ignoring death is that while society as a whole is able to live unburdened by the worries of mortality, those who face a nearing death must face it alone. To clarify, this isn't implying that the common person goes around beating up people with stage 4 cancer. Rather, it is simply an expression of how the ignorance of death in a community makes it difficult for people to be as understanding or supportive with those who suffer from terminal conditions. There are also unseen consequences for the town itself. It is no coincidence that both Judgment and the Immortal Cell lie buried underneath the town, locked behind a 4-key door that cannot be opened without seeing both death and the struggles to cope with it firsthand. The people of the central town have become civilized by burying their fear of death and burying their reliance on survival instinct with it. Yet, none of them have faced it. Their fear of death, their will to live, both lie somewhere deep down, waiting for the moment when danger presents itself so that they can burst out in a primal attempt to protect the body. And there is nothing innately wrong with this. It is this fear-driven adrenaline that helps people fend off attackers or escape from burning buildings. And it is the desire to live that keeps everyone going in the first place. But death cannot be avoided forever, So when a terminal condition, or even simply old age, puts death much closer than it has ever been before, fear and desire cannot prevent the inevitable. These basic mechanisms for survival end up working to prevent us from enjoying our last moments. That is, unless we face them head on. The Drifter has seen everything he needs to, has raised the 4 pillars to unlock the 4-key door within his mind. He has nothing left to do but descend into the abyss and face his fear of death. The Drifter descends into a giant underground world, viewing all around him the representation of the inner mechanisms of his mind. He sees once again the imagery of the animals with their pillars of light, and though this is closer to being a tie-in with the lore of the game, it still serves its purpose as a reminder of the 4 regions' obsession with death, an obsession that the Drifter has by now internalized. The Drifter walks past, and his path leads him to the top of a giant staircase. He descends further down, into the deepest parts of his mind. Judgment flashes menacingly from place to place, trying to intimidate the Drifter away from confrontation. But the Drifter knows what he must do, and he is running out of time to do it. Finally, he arrives at a giant hangar door with a beautiful symbol in the center, but he knows the corruption that lies behind it. He opens the door and is met with the horrific sight of his corrupt will to live. Judgment bursts into the room, and the Drifter's confrontation with his fear of death begins. After a long and hard-fought battle, Judgment finally yields. The Drifter moves to finish off his fear of death, but when he drops to land his final blow, he sinks his sword into the immortal cell itself, destroying his corrupt will to live and desire for immortality, and his fear of death along with it. The Drifter falls to the floor, and the cavern begins to collapse around him. He stands up, coughing up blood as he tries to escape the falling rubble. The Drifter can no longer do anything but run. Any other input results in making his condition worse, sending him into a coughing fit. The Drifter cannot rush death, cannot fight it, or do anything about it. He can only follow as Anubis patiently guides him to his final resting place. The Drifter does not exit the way he came. Instead, he arrives at a darker version of where he first woke up. His journey to come to terms with death has brought him to the same place as he started, only now he can see the darkness around him for what it truly is. The Drifter leans up against the wall and slides down into a sitting position as Anubis watches over him. The Drifter has completed his journey. He has finally come to terms with his condition. The Drifter fades away as the rubble falls around him, but he is not afraid. Having defeated his fear of death, the Drifter is able to be at peace in his last moments, and he passes away with the final vision of a serene ocean and a beautiful sunrise. To many, this ending is less than satisfactory. Why would the Drifter travel so far and wide just to die right after the climax? Was it all for nothing? Of course, Hyperlight Drifter isn't about searching for a cure from death. The Drifter was never meant to live forever. Hyperlight Drifter is an allegory, and within this metaphor, the Drifter completes his journey, and his internal conflict is resolved, even as he fades away. Even so, there is no way to be sure that this is the true meaning of the game. Hyperlight Drifter is abstract, and can have a different message for all who play it. As inappropriate as it feels to invoke the theory of the death of the author, death is inevitable, and pieces as abstract as this game should be free to thrive within their nature, rather than be trapped by their ephemeral creators. Alex Preston knows it. It is why he is so insistent on remaining uninvolved from the community's interpretation of his work. No matter how the game is interpreted, however, one thing is for certain. Hyperlight Drifter is art. And through its awe-inspiring visuals, incredible soundtrack, and powerful metaphor, Hyperlight Drifter is beautiful.